Hi everyone, I'm Gary Summers and welcome to the audio edition of Mind, Body, Soul.
We're going to touch on a very important topic today. OCD is one of those terms that some people misuse as a way to describe people who like things super clean or arranged just so. But if you have the actual condition, that's obsessive compulsive disorder, how it affects your life is very real. My next guest is a registered social worker and holistic naturopathic therapist, and she is going to debunk this condition and help you understand the issues that people dealing with OCD face. Welcome, Laurie Pinhorn.
Hello, thanks for having me back again.
For your third time.
I know.
You are the most, you have had the most appearances on this show.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Frequent flyer.
That'll tell our listeners the wealth of knowledge that you have. So, Laurie, can you kind of give a brief overview of what our listeners can expect to hear about OCD today?
Sure. We're going to talk about therapies, talking interventions and behavioral interventions that have been scientifically proven to help people live better with OCD. And we're also going to talk about what OCD actually is and what it's not, and also give some help for and hope for people who are living with OCD because recovery is possible.
It's a very little understood concept when you're looking at it from the outside, looking in.
So, Laurie, let's get into OCD. Can you just explain to our listeners exactly what it is? Because some people have different ideas of what exactly OCD is.
Well, OCD is a diagnosed mental health concern. And when you're worried about, are you stuck in compulsive rituals, when you really need to kind of go to talk with somebody who's has the skill set of giving you the proper diagnosis, because OCD is not, I like to have things in order. I like my pens to be laid out in a certain way because it looks nice and it helps me stay organized and things like that. OCD is a fear-based response to a thought, an intrusive thought that you have. And when people are living with OCD with a formal diagnosis of OCD under the criteria of what it is, because you actually have to, somebody who's going to give you your OCD diagnosis needs to ask you a lot of questions about, well, what are you thinking and what have you tried to kind of get that thought out of your head, and how much time in the run of the day are you actually losing as a result of being pushed around by your OCD. So your OCD is telling you to check something and then double check something, and or washing your hands compulsively over and over again. So depending on how much time you are losing in your day, being wrapped up in those thoughts and in those behaviors, is going to kind of either give you that diagnosis or not. So we've got this like Pinterest, I guess, idea of, we see a picture of towels wrapped up perfectly and everything is stacked perfectly, and people start to use this word, well, you're so OCD, or I'm so OCD today. That is very different than having a neurological, fear-based, heart-racing thought of something dreadful is going to happen if I don't do this thing. And those are very, very different things. And anybody who lives with OCD, and I know lots of people because they come to see me for that, would be not feeling great about somebody saying, oh, I'm just so OCD today because I want my pens lined up in a certain way. It's not the same thing.
Yeah, because some people get the idea that you walk into someone's bathroom and they got the towels done and stuff like that and done just right. And the first thing that you think about is, well, that person is OCD. They may, but they may not.
But they may not.
Right.
If the towels need to be in a certain way because there is going to be a car accident, or I'm going to get cancer, stuff like that. Or I have to look for the number 6 everywhere, or else something awful is going to happen. Or I have to do everything in a certain ritualized way, or else something is going to happen poorly to myself, to the world, to somebody else that I love. Then that's a different thing.
So when we're on the outside looking at this type of behavior, and where you talk about being so fear-based, that can be very overwhelming.
Very overwhelming.
To people. And so we want to give listeners a deep understanding of how this works. So can you talk about the neurology of it?
So There is a part of our brain that's a very ancient structure. It's called your limbic center, and inside your limbic center is your amygdala. And when we scan the brains of people who live with OCD, what we see is that people, when they start to think about this thing that it's hard to get out of that thought loop, when we scan the brains, what we see is that people are actually there's a lot of glucose burn and activity in their limbic centers. And so when the treatments that are provided are done very cautiously and slowly, and like talking therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, and exposure and response prevention therapy, which is one of the therapies that's kind of lifted up in the top in the OCD world, and also acceptance and commitment therapy. What we can see once we scan brains after the treatment, and sometimes medicines too, because medicine has a role here in the CBT treatment for OCD, what happens is we sort of see people just sort of organically lift out of their limbic centers and into their prefrontal cortex, where the logic centers live a little bit more. So we can actually rewire people's brains and nervous systems through the treatment. So, years ago, we would say to people when they had an official diagnosis of anything, not just OCD, we would say, like, gosh, that's unfortunate, and here's how things are wired now, and we're going to help you with medicine, and we're going to give you some coping tools and things like that. But sort of that's the way things are. We thought that the brain was sort of rigid and concrete, sort of. That's the way things are. But now we know that you can make changes to your brain and your nervous system with some hard work. And there's this concept called neuroplasticity, which is, we can retrain your brain and your nervous system to operate in a different way. So when you're in a fear-based situation, so if I'm afraid, I didn't check the stove 5 times. Did I check it 5 times or 4 times or 6 times? And I'm driving down the road and you're like, no, I got to turn around and go back because I'm afraid the house is going to burn down because I didn't check enough. You're actually activating the sympathetic nervous system. Your heart is racing, you're sweating, you have these intrusive thoughts of the house is going to burn down and everybody that I love in the house is going to burn down. It's going to be my fault because I didn't check 5 times. So I'm going to go back and check again.
Are there common reasons why people develop OCD? Is it a response to something that happens, or does it just happen?
Well, it's more common than people know. I just finished an online conference where there were some new numbers, like 1 in 40 adults, 1 in 100 children will have that sort of intrusive thought, and they get caught in that thought loop of, what if this happens? And then it's sort of like some of us have record players now because they're a new thing, but your record has a skip in it. It's sort of like it goes around, it goes bum bum, yeah. It goes around bum bum. It's sort of like you're caught in that loop of what if, and it's or like a hiccup in the brain, like you just can't lift out of it. And with some good training and some good therapy, people can sort of organically just sort of give some space between them and that intrusive thought.
Laurie, what about a genetic component to OCD?
There is scientifically some questions about a genetic vulnerability to develop OCD. There's also in the pediatrics world, in the children's world, where sometimes people get really sick and they get a strep infection. And if you notice, like, things were pretty good for my kid, and then right after the strep infection, there has been like a fear of, okay, I can't eat meat, or I can't go outside unless the sun is shining, or lots of compulsive thoughts and rituals and stuff. That's a specific type of OCD in the pediatrics world called PANDAS or PANS. And the treatment for that is a bit different. Parents, if you're hearing me and you see that, take your kid to the doctor because there's a medical procedure that can help. I was at an international OCD conference a couple of years ago, and there were families and doctors there talking specifically about that type of OCD. But what happens when we're young, we don't do this on purpose, but we sort of start to pair. The brain is really easy to train, like the old classical conditioning, My dog knows that he's going for a walk when I pick up his red leash, he knows he's going. So we can train our brain really quickly that when I have this thought, I need to do this thing. And that is where the beginnings of OCD can happen, because it is like building a muscle. So if you have an intrusive thought when you're a teenager that I have to do this thing in order for this bad thing not to happen, and you continuously practice that, then it's going to get more entrenched. That's the treatment for OCD, is the opposite of that.
So OCD is more than just wanting things in place. Can you talk about the successful counseling and treatments for individuals living with OCD?
Exposure and response therapy is really exciting, and it's not an easy treatment because what you're actually doing is exposing yourself to the thing that you're afraid of, and it takes a skilled clinician to be able to do that in a way that you don't get so scared that you drop out of therapy. So if I had a compulsion of washing, say, the exposure and response therapy would be, well, let's figure out on a fear-based scale of 1 to 10, how scary would it be for you to say, I'm not going to wash my hands 10 times, I'm only going to do it 9 times. And on a scale of 1 to 10, the person says, well, actually, that would be a 9 for me. I'd be really scared at that. So that's not where you start the exposure therapy. You start really low and really slow. So if they said, well, I'm not going to wash the amount of times that I want to, but I'm just going to decrease it by half of that, I could do that. That's a 3 or a 4 on my scale of fear. You start really low and really slow. And maybe that's not where you start either. Maybe your conversation is the exposure. You're just going to say, what would happen if you didn't wash as much? And people like, oh, I'm feeling scared already.
You can see
just talking about it. I don't even want to talk about it. Let's not talk about it. And so you might just do exposures through general conversation. You could do exposures through pictures. I've had clients who are really afraid of contamination from proteins like meats and things like that. So people go home with homework. The exposure therapy is not easy, and sometimes you have to convince people that today is a good day to do hard things, right? So you could do video recordings. We did a video recording of a client of mine who was afraid that the germs from meat was actually going to crawl from the meat over the table onto him and overwhelm him and make him sick. He was going to end up at the hospital and all of that. So we actually did an audio recording of what that fear was. And his job for the next week was to go home and just listen to that audio recording of what the fear was. And then eventually when that got easy, because what you're trying to do is expose your nervous system to the thing that you're afraid of, and then just sit with the uncomfortableness and have that learning that, yeah, my fear is going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and I'm going to be okay. And then some of his homework was to look at pictures of meat. I would go on the internet and find pictures of meat and send it to him and his family would sit around and look at the pictures and talk about it. And then eventually the exposure went into, we actually cooked together. So are you afraid with the tray of chicken sitting next to you? Yeah, I'm really afraid. So we'd, expose and expose and expose to the point where, you can have people who were really afraid of contamination. I don't want this even in my house. I'm going to have a flood, a panic attack because this contamination thing is in my house, to actually eating it. And that's really cool. Like you can actually see people do that. But the exposures have to be low, slow, and the person who's doing the exposure therapy needs to drive the bus.
What's important for our listeners to understand is when you talked about neural plasticity and the ability of our brain to adapt and to change, it's also important for our listeners to understand that they taught themselves, that their brain taught themselves this link between the fear and the response. That's the bad thing, but the good thing is if you can teach yourself something, you can also unteach yourself
totally
something and teach yourself something different, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the treatment now too is also moving towards a little bit more of a holistic approach that, the talking therapy is going to be good and necessary, but it's only going to take you so far. So we talk about intrusive thoughts all the time in OCD treatment or anxiety treatment as well, and we all have intrusive thoughts. Like the human brain is a thought-pumping machine, and unfortunately, in the OCD world, what's happened is the person who's living with that condition is putting a lot of meaning to those thoughts, and you get caught in that thought loop. So thoughts are way more sticky. I think of like Velcro, right? In an OCD and anxiety treatment, a thought comes in, and I'm aware that I have the thought. I'll maybe sit with it, but I'm going to try to detach from it and kind of let it go. And that's really hard to do because the limbic center thoughts get like Velcro. I call them sticky thoughts, right? So I say to people all the time, when did you notice that your thoughts were more sticky today than yesterday? And quite often it's because sleep was off, because limbic centers are very tender when sleep is off. When there's a lot of sugar in the diet and there's no exercise. There's a neat piece of research that came out of Harvard University just a couple of years ago that put populations of people who are living with OCD. One treatment group got talking therapy and medicine, and the other group got mindfulness training and exercise. And the group of people who did the mindfulness and meditation, their OCD symptoms decreased by 40%. One of the very first things that I do with people who live with anxiety and OCD is a practice that's called externalizing. So you actually give your OCD a name, because OCD is like going to a party where somebody was invited, who somebody wasn't invited, and they come anyway. We all got that person in our lives like, oh God, I hope they don't come to the party. OCD is like that.
Yeah.
They weren't invited, but they're here. And how are you going to have a different relationship with your OCD? So sometimes it is this movement from me and OCD are so tightly fused together to I notice that I'm having intrusive thoughts, right? To I notice that my OCD is telling me to do this. So people give it a name, we give it a color, we give it a shape, we give it a whatever, so that down the road, when people start to recover, OCD is sneaky too. It wants to come back. So we have to kind of help the family members and the people who live in homes with people who live with OCD say, hey, is that you who really want to do that? Or is that anxious Annie telling you to do that? Because the talking therapy is trying to create a different relationship with the thought. Like, you don't have to believe every thought that you have in your head.
And I think for our listeners, for those of you living with OCD, when I talk to the people who come to see me as well, I always tell them, there's really nothing wrong with you. Your brain is working the way it was designed to do, but it's working against you. It's not working for you, and you just need to retrain your brain so that it works for you. You also talked about acceptance and commitment. Did you want to just talk about that for a second?
Sure, yeah. Acceptance and commitment therapy is a extension of CBT, of cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the big foundations of acceptance and commitment therapy is the acceptance piece of, okay, this is what it is. This is what I got to deal with, and this is the reality of how I'm going to, live my life. And there's also a commitment piece of acceptance and commitment therapy. Is like, well, what are you actually going to commit to in order to have this happy, healthy life? And so you might commit to externalizing. You might commit to having a different relationship with your thoughts, or you might commit to having great sleep because this is important to you. And another important piece of the ACT is values. So you're going to live according to the things that are important to you. So I've seen people do things in the OCD world that are really scary because it's attached to a value. So, well, I really want to go to my sister's wedding and have a good time. So therefore, I'm going to work really hard at this so that doesn't bleed into a value area of my life, right? Or I want to do really good at school, so I need to figure out how I'm going to get an extra hour and a half of my day away from the compulsion so that I want to go to school. So the values piece, the commitment piece, the acceptance piece can be a really good add-on to the CBT. And some of the experts in the OCD world are starting to lift up ACT as another treatment process. And also, the acceptance and commitment therapy builds in a lot of living in the present. So that's another core value of ACT. So if you're able to train your brain to say, okay, my thoughts are way in the past of like, wow, that was scary, don't forget about that, or you must do this because this bad thing is going to happen into the future. An ACT therapist is going to be very much about, well, like, let's just non-judgmentally notice that your thoughts are there. It incorporates a lot of mindfulness and meditation, and like, just come back here in the present day moment here, because that's where you have your most power, and that's where your therapy is going to happen. And, with the ACT treatment, you're sort of training yourself to come back here to this time. That's important. And so that's how the ACT can, on many levels, bleed into the CBT for OCD.
Laurie, what about people who are living with someone who has OCD? I guess there are some things that you can do that can be really helpful, and there are other things you can do that can be very detrimental?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question because quite often OCD is very sneaky, so it likes to pull people around us into the rituals. So this could be an example of, and what we call that in the treatment world is accommodation. So if I'm a young person and I have OCD, and say I have a contamination fear and I'm washing my hands all the time, my parents might be involved in the ritual by making sure there's enough soap, by making sure the hand towels are washed and they're there and they're ready for me. And part of the treatment is to get all the family members on track, because if my OCD can't get mom involved in it, my OCD might get my brother involved in it. So like it's important for everybody to kind of be on the same page. We really want to make sure that parents or other loved people don't do this accommodation, because that will just reinforce, wow, this is really scary. I need to do this. So I guide parents all the time in saying, like, how are we going to gently and compassionately pull you out of the accommodation? And so the conversation with the kids or even the adolescents might be like, I love you so much that I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to pull myself out, but I'm not going to just do it tomorrow. Me and you together are going to figure out how can I pull myself out of this ritual that the OCD has pulled me into.
How would it look like for a parent who has a child with an obsessive washing their hands?
Mm-hmm.
How would it look like to a parent to gradually pull themselves back from that? Because you wouldn't just say, well, I'm not putting any towels in the bathroom. I mean, that's just too drastic.
It would be done again very low and slow, and it would be done by the person who is being in distress because of the OCD. They would need to agree on that first. So you might be doing exposure and response therapy to something else first to kind of build the confidence level that, yeah, I can do hard things. It would be that, what can I pull out of that would still be okay for you? And then we would work on that for a little period of time. And then what else can I pull out of? And so it might be really small. It might on the outside look like, wow, how is that going to make any difference at all, right? But it might be something really, really tiny that builds up the confidence. This book here called Talking Back to OCD, who John March wrote the book, is a really great guide for families who have children or adolescents living with OCD. And he says quite clearly, parents, you have to be compassionate. You have to be empathetic. This is really, really hard. And when you thought you couldn't be any more compassionate, you have to be compassionate again, because this is really hard work. The kids are caught up in this fear that this needs to happen. So it's a connected, compassionate, the person who has the OCD is sort of driving the bus. And sometimes we have put things in place that are little sort of prizes at the end of the exposure therapy. So people really don't want to do the exposure therapy, and lots of people don't. So it is like, okay, kid, like, is there something that you really want? Like, is it this Nerf gun, or is it this trip to the rec room, or wherever it is? So every day that you do a little exposure, you're sort of building up a point system to get this big ticket item, because it's a value thing, right? You're incorporating a value into the exposure therapy. I had a client one time who was so afraid of contamination in a bathroom that she wouldn't brush her teeth in the bathroom where other people brushed their teeth. So that's where we started, So you got 3 points every day if you brushed your teeth in that bathroom where everybody else brushed their teeth. And eventually, like, now when I meet with that family, it's like, remember when we had to do exposures about brushing your teeth? And now you're like, wow, that's way, like, that's a long, long time ago, So
can you leave our listeners with a couple of things that may be able to be helpful right now?
Yeah. If you're looking for a counselor or a support person to help with the OCD thoughts, I would right out the gate on the conversation with the therapist say, are you somebody who does OCD treatment? Because it's a different type of treatment than you would if you were living with depression. Do you understand CBT? Do you understand the exposure and response therapy? Because that's really where it's at. That's where the research would say, we really need the talking therapy and the behavioral therapy to be around that. And get resources, read books. The International OCD Foundation has a great Facebook feed and website. The Peace of Mind Foundation, too, the woman that runs the Peace of Mind Foundation is a psychiatrist who lives with OCD, and the stuff that comes through the feed there and the stuff that they're doing is really, really good. If you have a child who lives with OCD, search out the movie called Unstuck. It's a great documentary. They highlight 5 or 6 kids and their OCD treatment and their journey, and it's just a great resource to watch if your family has a young person who lives with OCD.
Thanks for taking the time, Laurie. Great conversation, and I'm sure we'll have you back again.
I'd love to.
That's it for this week, everybody. We'll be back again next week with another interesting guest.